Hello, everyone. My name's Roy Barton. I'm president of the Institute of Value Management Australia. In this series, I'm going to describe the concepts of value and value for money, all within the overall process of value management as practiced here in Australia and indeed in many parts of the world. I like to start everything I do with a clear statement of purpose, and this is no exception. So here we go. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce the concept of value as defined in the Australian Standard on Value Management, which is AS 4183/2007, and as used in the practice of value management. Now, please note the highlighted word in red here, the concept of value. I'm going to be leaving the broader one of value for money to the second in this series. And so today, I'm really focusing specifically on the subject of value. And you will see as I go through this presentation how and why we separate the concept of value from value for money and treat them separately. But I'll be coming to that later in the presentation. As for now, I'm focusing specifically on the concept of value as we have defined it in the Australian Standard on Value Management. It's important to see that the terms value and value for money are used in so many different ways, with so many potentially different meanings. And there are always numerous views about why a particular entity has value, whether that entity happens to be a new hospital, a new road, a new sewage treatment plant, a new car, or even a product of the supermarket. There are always these various views. The Australian Standard on Value Management seeks to provide a common language, as well as a consistent process to achieve better value for money. One of my former students wrote to me just last year saying that she'd found, I think it was something close to 500 different references and uses of the single word value whilst doing internet searches and searching through places like Wikipedia and other places. But it is quite astonishing to see the ways in which this term value is used. Typically, when we're starting off from teaching workshops and seminars, we will start with a kind of an icebreaker, and I get the people to discuss in small groups and then jot down on flip charts typical or common uses of the term value. And it's quite amazing as you work around the room looking at all the different terms and different applications of this word value. It's why in the Australian Standard we set about trying to establish that common language. Now, it's worth asking the question, why is anything of value? I mean literally anything, whether it be this gadget in my hand now, which I'm using to move the PowerPoint slides forward, whether it be the TV screen that I'm staring at as I'm preparing this presentation, whether it be the room that you're in as you're watching this, literally anything we can identify where the value lies in three specific factors. The first of these factors is the notion of useful purpose. For something to have value, it must fulfill some useful purpose. One of the first things we do in a value management study, as you'll see when we get into case examples later in this series, is to get a crystal clear statement of purpose, and in particular, the primary purpose of a particular entity, whatever that entity might be. Those of you who might be familiar with the American literature on this subject, you would have come across and be familiar with the term basic function. When you look at the way they define that, they define it as the primary purpose of something. I much prefer the term primary purpose for reasons which I'll explain later. But right now, I just want to focus on that notion of purpose, useful purpose, primary purpose. It's why something has value. But the notion of value does not stop purely with the matter of purpose. It might fulfill, the entity might fulfill a useful purpose. And as a result of doing that, benefits will flow. Beneficial outcomes will be accrued. And this also is a component of the value picture. The third factor is the set of important features and characteristics of a particular entity. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment or two. Now, with those three factors, we can capture and define the value of literally anything. Now, it would be rather nice if one could simply sit down at one's desk and write out those factors for a particular entity, whatever that entity is. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on the way you look at it, that's not the case, because there are multiple perceptions of purpose. There are multiple perceptions of beneficial outcomes, and there are multiple perceptions of important features. And it doesn't take much imagination to see why that is the case. What may be of great importance to me may be of no importance to you whatsoever. Yet we might have an interest in exactly the same entity or object or whatever it might be, the same hospital, the same school. But things that are important may be very different to me from very different to you. But we have to capture those concepts of important if we're truly to understand and define where the value is. But even on things like purpose and primary purpose, there's often very, very broad differences of opinion, particularly when we start off a value management study. Setting up this value triangle is the very first thing that I do in any value management workshop. But the useful purpose, bringing a group to alignment on that, is really crucial. Many of you will have seen the British TV series Yes Minister, which goes back a number of years now, but still keeps popping up, I see, from time to time. One of the episodes of that series was the one that dealt with a hospital with no patients. The hospital, a brand new hospital, was finished. It was up and running. It had about, 500 or something administrators. It was very, very busy, but they had no patients. And there's the one scene which I often use in teaching value management, and a scene that I'll never forget. It's where the Minister for Health is sitting opposite the head bureaucrat, Sir Humphrey Appleby, and discussing the purpose of this hospital, which has no patients in it. And the minister yells at the chief bureaucrat, saying, "But the purpose of the hospital is to treat the sick." And the head bureaucrat, Sir Humphrey Appleby, says, no, Minister, that's just one of the things that we do. We have to do all of these things, with or without the patients. And our staff are really overworked doing all of these things, but there's no patients. So even something like a hospital, where probably most of the community would agree that treating the sick is what it's all about, even on that, there are many, many different perceptions. So I've had the privilege of working on value management studies on projects all around the world, on some massive projects into billions of dollars and others much smaller. But this notion of purpose is really crucial. We must bring the group to alignment on the notion of purpose. And the reason for that is because individual people always plan and design in accordance with their perception of purpose. And it is perception. It is perception. And the task in the VM process is to bring the people together and get them to come to agreement on what those purposes are. They're usually 3 or 4 in the category that I call primary purposes. There are multiple perceptions of beneficial outcomes. We need to find out what they are and get them established. And we need to find out the things that are important that will give value to a particular entity. Now, by way of example, let's think about this train here, or this train service perhaps. We see here an image of the Singapore MRT. I'm very familiar with Singapore. I do a lot of my projects are in Singapore and have been over the last 25 years or so. But this is a typical MRT, could be a commuter train anywhere on Earth. And so we ask, why does it have value? Now, keeping in mind what I said about the multiple perceptions, we start off with the passenger. After all, the thing is being designed initially for the passengers. So let's start with them. And we'll say, what are the perceptions of value that we must take into account? Well, from the passenger's point of view, I suspect that most, if not all of them, would say that the purpose, the useful purpose, is it takes me from A to B. And if it doesn't do that, then this train has no value to me. That's a very important idea there. If it doesn't fulfill the primary purpose, then it will have no value to that particular person, to that particular stakeholder. That's an important observation. So taking me from A to B is a crucial part of the thing. The benefits or beneficial outcomes, well, one is that it gets me to work on time. Now, in Singapore, the train has a reliability of something like 99.9% reliability. Indeed, if it has a breakdown, it makes headline news the following day in the newspaper. It's such a rare event. So it gets me to work on time, and that's a great benefit, which you could not get if you travel on the road, of course, or even by bus, because you may be stuck in the traffic or whatever. And an example of important features would be things like regularity, frequency, reliability. And clearly we can see that a train or train service that has greater frequency, greater regularity, greater reliability will be of more value than one which has less frequency, less regularity, and certainly less reliability. But you see the way the idea that value then is built within those three factors. Now, if we change hats for a moment and think not just of the passenger, but of a number of stakeholders, let's imagine we're actually working on the design of the new train itself. Well, why does the train have value to the train driver? Excuse me. We'll see that even though the train is the same, it's a fundamentally different set of value factors than those defined by the passengers. For example, its purpose is that it provides employment. The train driver isn't worried if it goes from A to B, Y to Z, he'll take the train anywhere. No, he or she is only concerned with the fact that it provides employment as a primary purpose. One of the benefits is that it puts food on the table. And one of the important features would be to do with health and safety at work. There would, of course, be lots more. We could create a whole list if we brought together a stack of train drivers together. These are just examples. But here we can see a completely different set of value factors, even though the entity is the same. Now, we could keep doing this. I'm not going to do it in this presentation. It would bore you to tears. But we could keep doing it. And for example, we could do one for the Ministry of Transport, for the Tourism Commission, for the Department of Finance, whoever it might be. And they would all have their particular spin on this. Now, it may well be that because we're designing it primarily for passengers, well then of course the set of factors for the passengers will take prominence. Even so, all of these others must still be taken into account if we truly want to establish where the value lies in the particular entity. Now, we refer to these three, as I said, as the value factors, and collectively we can define the elements in this triangle, or the factors in this triangle, as a value statement. That term value statement is not a term we used when writing the Australian Standard. I tended to use the phrase just in practice a little later, but I use it all of the time now. And as far as I know, my students and others do as well. So we produce a value statement, and that's the very first task, or one of the very first tasks within a value management study. Once we've got that value statement defined and agreed to, then we can use that as an ongoing source of reference in all that we do in a value management study. Excuse me again, thank you. Okay, let's move on. So the value statement then may be used to guide planning and design decisions and to form the basis for comparisons in determining value for money, which we'll come on to in the next presentation. The value statement lists the useful purposes of the entity, and particularly the primary purpose, the reason for being, the raison d'etre. This is what we've got to establish. And please understand that's not something you do in 30 seconds. You've got a group of people together and you ask them the question, why does this entity, or why will it exist when it's complete and it's constructed or whatever? And there'll be a wide range of statements made initially, lots of assumptions, lots of discussion, and then we bring the whole group to consensus on, okay, this is then the reason for existence, its primary purpose, its reason for being. This becomes the light on the hill, as it were, a constant reference as the workshop proceeds, and indeed, in some cases, for 2 or 3 years later, as the project develops. It also lists the benefits that the entity brings and the important features or characteristics of the entity. Now, so that's the notion of value, and that's how we define value in accordance with the Australian standard. We recognise that value and value for money are not the same thing, and therefore we treat them separately. When I say not the same thing, why would we have two terms? Why would we have value and value for money if they're intended to be the same thing? They're not the same thing. Sometimes the term value is used with no reference to money whatsoever. In other cases, of course, it's entirely used to do with money. So we recognise, though, that value and value for money are in fact different concepts, and we want to treat them separately. So value we have already defined. We now start to move on to the broader one of value for money. Now, ever since I wrote up my PhD thesis, going way back a number of years now, I've been influenced by the writings of this man, Daniel Bernoulli, famous philosopher and mathematician. And he wrote, amongst a lot of other things, but he wrote in 1738. 1738, there's nothing new under the sun. In 1738, he said this: the value is what we're talking about. The value of an item must not be based on its price, but rather on the utility which it yields. Can we get this right? The value is not in its price, but in the utility which it yields. You've probably heard the saying a number of times. You might even know someone in this category, about the person who seems to know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. The cost cutters out there are classic for this sort of behavior. Cut, 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 cut costs, lower the price, but the value goes out the window. The value may be very significantly reduced. So our idea is to identify the value separate from the money. We want to identify the value, and we see that the notion of value is in the utility, that is, in that value triangle. It's in the useful purpose, it's in the benefits that delivers to the important features. We can wrap that triangle up in this concept of utility that Bernoulli is describing here. So way back in 1738, he said that, and having first read that when I was writing at my own PhD thesis, it had huge influence on me, and to this day still does. So then, we've seen where our value is. The value is on this side of the triangle, this left-hand side here. We can see here now, this is where the value is. It's the combination of the useful purpose, the beneficial outcomes, the important features and characteristics. But here is our money. Our money is over here on this side. So on the left-hand side, we've got our value. On the right-hand side, we've got our money. So we can see we've got a number of options. There are always options. We'll get into this in more detail in the next presentation. But as for now, we can see that on the one hand, we've got our value defined. And then on the other side of the picture, we can start to develop options. How do we deliver this particular entity that delivers this purpose, delivers these benefits and these important features and characteristics? The number of options that are available for us to do it, and what are the costs of those options, and which of those options will deliver best value for money becomes the question. And we're going to deal with that in the next presentation. So here's the value and here's the money. And so that brings us then to the end of this first presentation. We'll move on from here to explore the way in which we identify the opportunities, the options to deliver best value for money, how we measure value for money, how we decide if we've got good value for money. And that'll come up in presentation 2. So thank you very much for listening to this one, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.